from the very start, Buddhist practitioners have been talking about meditating upon and realizing what's being called the three marks of existence, which are impermanence, suffering, and no self. So pretty heavy stuff. And sometimes people have been talking about four marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, no self, and nirvana, or freedom. So how is it that after these three marks, which are pretty, what do I want to say, pretty challenging. I guess impermanence is challenging for all of us. When suffering comes up in whatever kind, it's challenging for us. And with no self, maybe the idea is challenging, right? And then there's nirvana, freedom. Well, we could look at this for the next 3 months. So maybe suffice it to say that Nagarjuna, one of the great ancestors in the Zen tradition, said, "The one who deeply sees into the world of birth and death sees nirvana." The one who deeply sees, oh, that's me now. The one who deeply sees into the three marks of existence, impermanence, suffering, and no self, actually sees nothing but nirvana. So also from the start in Buddhism, they have been talking about a root cause of suffering. What's a root cause for us not so often feeling free? And one of the first teachings was to speak about grasping in its various ways. Grasping for pleasure, grasping to avoid suffering. But a little later on, what people call the Mahayana tradition, so also in Zen, they have specified this, and they talked about specifically the grasping of a separate permanent self. Now this is how I start out tonight, because in Dōgen's teaching that we have been looking at, I think Dōgen highlights this grasping of a separate self as actually the central issue of Zen practice. He suggests that this be our focus of meditation on and off the cushion. And this is just a reminder. Dōgen gives this teaching actually in a letter to a lay student. I find this important. He gives it to people like us. In doing so, he doesn't write this, but the whole Genjo Koan, this letter to his lay student, is one thorough and beautiful expression of validating lay practice, of saying you do not have to spend your entire life in a Zen monastery, maybe not even 10 years, to actually realize nirvana. And as you know, Genjo Koan can be translated as actualizing the fundamental point. So from the perspective of what we have been doing over the past weeks, I rhetorically ask, so what is the fundamental point? And my answer right away is studying the grasping of a separate self. And if I may remind you of Dogen's teaching, he writes, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. I think in a deeply poetic way and very clear, very succinctly, Dōgen lays out a meditation program here. That's, in these few sentences, he expresses the entire program of entering and realizing the Buddha way, of entering and realizing practice of awakening. And with each one of these 5 sentences, I think Dōgen opens up deeper layers of study, of meditation, and realization. So at this point in my practicing with you, I recognize 3 levels of study and realization here. So I'm thinking it's a little bit like this metaphor I sometimes use of Zen meditation is like diving into the ocean. The first level is like swimming on the surface. There's a lot to see, a lot to do. At times, it's pretty strenuous. And then when you dive deeper, things become more peaceful and quiet. And in my imagination, at least, you can see a lot. You can see very far. And maybe sometimes a shark swims by or a fellow diver. But then you can also sink to the very bottom of the ocean. That's a third level. It's completely dark here, nothing to be seen. But it's also very dense. And the whole situation oozes life. So by realization, I mean a little more than thinking. Maybe something like becoming intimate with, opening up to, and embodying a truth. So that's what I want to talk about now. These 3 levels of understanding, practice, and realization that I can find in Dogen's beautiful statement. Level 1 corresponds to the first 2 sentences. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. When Dōgen suggests we study the self, I think he refers to the three marks of existence, to studying impermanence, suffering, and no self as the central focus of our practice. As I guess we all know now, at least we heard it, but we also looked at it very deeply. A separate self does not exist, but there is a grasping of such a thing in us. And apparently, I would suggest we do this, we engage in this kind of grasping to counteract the basic truth of life. Which basic truth? Well, by doing so, we resist impermanence by holding on to the idea that there actually is something or someone permanent in us, something like a core, a true inner being existing by and out of itself. Someone, I'm thinking, like the last surviving warrior who resists and fights against the evil forces of impermanence. Now, in order for this imagination of a separate self, to function, it also needs to hold itself separate from everything else, as everything else indeed is impermanent, including our own body, thoughts, and emotions. And this holding itself separate comes at a cost. Because we don't think we imagine this separateness, but we think it's real. Because of that, life often feels unfulfilled, doesn't it? And so from this grasping of a separate self, we reach out to grasp other stuff in order to fill or to fulfill the self and make it feel real. I hope it's okay to say this, but it's almost funny when we can see this. Only almost. So we imagine a separate self as a stronghold against the suffering of impermanence. And we cannot see yet that it's exactly this holding on to a separate self that is indeed the cause of the very same suffering. Now, to also say this about the first level, Dōgen, I think, does not recommend a practice that could be described as cutting off of the ego, or simply saying or thinking, oh, it's all imagined anyway, it's an illusion and it does not exist. Actually, that's dangerous. It's a form of spiritual bypassing. And actually, it's a form of spiritual bypassing that feeds the grasping of a separate self. It makes it even stronger. Well, our mind is a trickster, isn't it? It's very creative. Now, what Dōgen recommends, I think, and what I feel we have been doing together is, as he says, to study the separate self. to become intimate with it, to understand how it's constructed, how it works, and what the consequences of its activities are. And maybe for a long time, this means that we have to begin over and over to actually find this grasping within ourselves, because so often it is quite hidden. So the grasping is real. However, the separate self is not. It does not exist at all. And because of this, second sentence, we can forget it, as Dōgen puts it. Not by trying to forget it, but by becoming intimate with it, by opening up to it, by studying it. And then, and I actually think only then, can we enter, I simply call it level 2, to talk about it, of our study, which Dōgen describes in the sentence, to forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. Well, from the beginning, Buddhism has been teaching dependent co-arising. That is, the truth that all beings and all things do not exist by themselves, do not arise out of themselves, but they depend on causes and condition external to them in order to exist. So the more we can let go of our grasping of a separate self, the more can we get in touch with the self as it really is. Namely, it is given to us, and it is given to us moment by moment, because what gives it to us constantly changes. So, that's also funny in a way, just thinking, this dependently co-arisen self is exactly the opposite of the separate self we cling to. It is impermanent. It is a no self in the sense that it does not exist out of itself and by itself. And also, it's often grateful and fulfilled as it understands that it constantly receives life from other beings and phenomena as a gift. And now I want to suggest to you, and we haven't talked about this yet, but I want to do it. This insight in the dependently co-arisen self, or the self that receives its life moment by moment from all things and from all beings, this is not nirvana or freedom yet. And I admit this is a tricky point. Let me try to explain it with my muddled mind. At first, when we open up to dependent co-arising, we think, and it seems to make sense to us, that certain things are the causes and conditions of other things. Like, you might know this, Thich Nhat Hanh's famous example of the page of a book we are reading, which, as he puts it, is actually not a page, but the rain, the trees, the factory workers, the sun, the economy, all coming together as a page. This understanding is wonderful and already shifts something. It's quite helpful, but it's not the end of the realization Dōgen speaks about. Now I'm suggesting to you, Dōgen expresses this third level of practice and realization by saying, when actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. I always found these sentences to be very beautiful, and yet very hard to comprehend. What are bodies and minds dropping away? Why no trace of realization? And what is this no trace, this mere whisper of language that continues nevertheless endlessly? Dependent co-arising is indeed a truth. And yet, I think it's also a trap. I sometimes even call it the Buddhist trap. Because, in truth, there are no things or real persons being the causes and conditions of other things or persons. This is just what we imagine. However, there is a life that is not imagined, and this life that really exists is empty of all of these imaginations, including the imaginations of dependent co-arising. Just think of the Heart Sutra, where we find these enigmatic, puzzling statements that all things neither arise nor cease, neither increase nor decrease. We just chanted it. There are bodies and minds, but please allow me to say, these are not the bodies and minds we imagine. Neither the separate bodies and minds, level 1, nor the dependently arisen bodies and minds, level 2. When we realize this, all these imaginations drop away. They might still appear, but we see through them. In Dōgen's words, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. But of course, it's not that everything is just imagined and nothing exists. This would be a grave misunderstanding. So what is it that is truly there? What's the content of the third realization? Well, Dōgen Zenji calls it a no trace. So something that exists and at the same time it doesn't exist. Something that is ungraspable, unimaginable, and yet it continues endlessly. In Mahayana, and definitely in Zen, some said and say that the true existence of all things is awareness, pure, luminous awareness. And Dōgen himself points out in another essay, Bendowa, that all things and all phenomena are just one mind. I think he would also be okay with saying all things and all beings are just one mind. This one mind, this awareness is beyond measure. This awareness, this mind, does not come and it does not go. It does not increase and it does not decrease. It is the realm of your true being. And maybe, I'm suggesting only, this is Dogen Zenji's no trace. And may you and all beings practice and realize it. Thank you very much.